Thank you very much, Danielle, and thanks to all of you for inviting me to join you this afternoon. I'm going to speak from a slightly different point in terms of the development of political economy analysis. We're actually seeing somewhat of a resurgence of an attention to political economy issues within USAID right now. And so what I'd like to do is, briefly talk about the journey that we're on in terms of integrating an attention to political economy issues into USAID, and place it a little bit more in terms of the broader discussions going on within the agency around issues of country ownership and engaging more directly with local actors to support and sustain reform. And then I'll close out with a few thoughts in terms of the ways that this approach might be leveraged in working more concertedly with our colleagues working on food security issues and thinking about how to develop some more collaborative approaches to reform. So USAID has kind of been going through a pendulum swing somewhat over the past 2 decades on this. Back in the early 1990s, we had one of the first political economy analysis tools that was deployed especially in the Middle East in the early 1990s. And this was later merged into what Danielle had mentioned, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Assessment Framework that we've been using really to develop sector strategies for governance work in a variety of missions over the past 20 years. But one of the things that we've been seeing as the center that's been engaged in doing a lot of these assessments over the past 5 years or so is that as you've gone into a mission, there's been an increasing interest amongst our colleagues in other sectors and really better understanding how the wider political context affects their programming. So if you're going in to do an assessment in Nepal, the findings are really, what we're looking at in terms of a DRG assessment is very much work directly in the governance sector, work with parliaments, work with political parties, with civil society and media. And there's an increasing interest in thinking about how that broader governance environment impacts work on agriculture or economic growth or health. And so that was really behind our thinking in terms of developing a political economy analysis framework for the agency. And I can say from the perspective of the democracy and human rights and governance sector that there really has been an increasing recognition that really is captured in the 2013 strategy that Danielle's just mentioned, that the work that we're doing even on governance issues is getting increasingly harder. On the one hand, I think that there is this increasing recognition that the quality of governance is really critical to the achievement and sustainability of results. But at the same time, we're confronting issues of closing space, problems of entrenched elites, and really recurrent cycles of crises. It becomes increasingly difficult to understand this unless you really do have that better contextual sense. Similarly, as we've now launched a new agency mission statement in the past year that's really focused on eradicating extreme poverty and supporting more resilient democratic societies, we recognize it's the tough cases that are left to us. And that absent far more effective programming that are able to help us better address the cycles and the patterns that perpetuate the exclusion of marginalized groups from access to goods and services, our efforts to really eradicate poverty or reduce extreme poverty or really support resilient democratic societies will be challenged at best. At the same time, over the past couple of years, there really has been a resurgence within USAID in terms of more concertedly working to support country ownership and engage more directly with local actors. And as we've thought through this, the partnerships are one piece of it, but there's also an increasing understanding that for us to be able to really more effectively support and sustain reform, again, there's a need to understand these deeper contextual issues, the actors that surround development challenges, the relationships between them, the resources they have to either blocking or sustaining reform. So our approach to political economy analysis, or this new approach that we're taking to political economy analysis, is very much driven by this understanding of the increasingly constraining space and the importance, I think, of looking more broadly at the resources that we bring as a development agency more broadly to supporting change. Thinking about how you could bring forward the work that colleagues do in the private sector with parent-teacher associations, with revenue generation boards, the work that we do in the DRG sector with parliament, civil society, and thinking about how we do this work together more concertedly. And that's really what's at the center of the work that we've been doing within the DRG Center on cross-sectoral work. So we've developed a framework for from use within the agency that I'll speak to just for a couple of minutes that really exists at 3 levels. Verena has talked a little bit about the work at the great work that the bank has done in terms of problem level analysis. But one of the things that we've seen over the past several years as USAID has really brought country strategies back is a need to really be able to look more broadly at the political context in the countries where we're working to enable us to really better focus resources where they can have the most impact. So the framework first has a set of country-level questions that you would be looking at to really consider, who the main drivers of change are, what are the resources they have to either facilitating or blocking reform, and really where the openings are to really engage successfully over the coming period of a strategy in terms of supporting reform. Secondly, we have questions that could be conducted first to inform a sector-level analysis, really looking at, for example, in the agriculture sector, who the main actors are, again, the resources they have to either blocking or supporting reforms, and also thinking more broadly about the reasons why previous interventions may not have worked. And then finally, at the issue level, much as Verena has talked about, to the extent you are looking at specific issues, whether it's fertilizer subsidies, for example, really getting a better understanding of the actors around these challenges, the resources, the contextual factors that are really either supporting or impeding change. And so we're in the process right now of piloting this political economy analysis framework. We've completed one pilot in Colombia just last month, and we're headed out to Ukraine in the next couple of weeks to look specifically at the issue of tuberculosis policy implementation. What we're trying to do, though, again, drawing on the experience of our colleagues in DFID, the bank, and other development agencies who've used this tool, is really trying to engage in a much more cross-sectoral way. Unfortunately, the DRG assessments have been seen over the past 20 years to be very much the province of governance officers. While there is this increasing interest in really understanding the wider applicability of the challenges that we're recognizing as we conduct these analyses. So we've been working very closely with our colleagues in the other pillar bureaus, the Bureau of Food Security, the Bureau of Global Health, and the Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, to really build a cross-sectoral cadre who has this understanding not only of the analysis, but really also deeper thinking in terms of how an analysis would in turn translate into better programming. And so really what we're trying to do is pilot this framework in a variety of different contexts with a variety of different sectors. We are working very closely with colleagues that are bringing this experience from DFID, from the bank, who are much more experienced in political economy analysis, but also looking at this as a tool for capacity development, not just in terms of conducting the analysis itself, but more broadly thinking about how you would take the really political economy analysis is almost a grammar for thinking and working more politically in the work that we do. So thinking not just about the factors that you're dealing with, but how these findings would really translate into programming. With the thought that you can have an analysis that's conducted in 2014, but when the minister is removed, when there's an election, when there's a crisis, the system of surrounding these development challenges is going to shift specifically. We want to have the capacity and the missions to be able to go in, refresh analysis, and frankly, change or shift programming as necessary to really, more effectively respond to the shifts in the system. So we're engaging in the pilots, we're engaging in training across cadres, and trying to build up a cadre of subject matter experts, both in Washington and in field missions, to really take this analysis forward. So what applicability does this have to the work that USAID does in food security programming? As Verena's mentioned, I think there's also a recognition within USAID that our aid matters now less than it ever did. As someone who's worked, in the former Soviet space and in Eastern Europe, we really recognize that there's much less of an opportunity to depend on aid itself to open doors or to get reform done. And I think this is especially the case for our colleagues working on issues such as agricultural policy reform, where there may not be the same empirical evidence base that you may have, for example, in the health sector. And the policies around issues like fertilizer subsidies are far more contentious and crowded with a number of potential winners and losers. And we often hear from our colleagues, in the health sector, in the ag sector, in economic growth, that it's often not the case that bad policies are simply a matter of poor information. Can we really expect to successfully push policies that don't have powerful local coalitions to support them? And I think that's especially true in places like Africa, where AIDS investments are increasingly focused. The intended beneficiaries of our programming are often poor, they're often very poorly organized, and they often are unaware of how particular policy changes may affect them, which makes it difficult to really build the more successful multi-sector or multi-stakeholder coalitions that are so critical to driving reform forward. Simply putting in place a consultative process, as we so often do, and trying to support champions in a kind of poor policy enabling environment and a low information environment are going to be insufficient in many cases to really adopting and implementing policies that truly address the extremely poor, unless we're really willing to think more deeply about how we might be able to think about addressing the power disparities that lie at the center of perpetuating poverty in the first place. So on the one hand, we're trying to build this cross-sectoral coalition to bring that analysis through the use of the political economy analysis framework to really deepen that understanding of the context around the policy choices that we would be working on around issues of food security. But I think the other thing that we've got to be thinking about, and something that we've been working very actively within USAID over the past few months on, is really thinking more broadly about not just the analysis, but building more multi-sector partnerships to take forward programming. What we're really hoping we'll be able to do with the use of the political economy analysis framework is to really help missions that are struggling with these issues to think through how you would develop a more political strategy for supporting reform and sustaining it over time. And as DRG officers in the field, we often bring linkages to parliaments, to civil society organizations, to media that are critical really in supporting those multi-stakeholder coalitions. There's been an increasing recognition over the past several years that there is a great deal of work going on in governance across sectors, and an increasing recognition that if we're going to be able to successfully address the governance gaps that really lie at the heart of some of the more entrenched development challenges that we have to deal with, we need to be working more concertedly across sectors. Over the past several months, I've been working very closely with my colleagues in the bureaus and the other pillar bureaus within USAID to develop an action plan for cross-sectoral governance integration that was just approved by our administrator 2 weeks ago. The thinking behind this is that, as you've seen, the increasing initiativization of work within USAID, a great deal of the governance work that's going on right now is going on in the other sectors. It's going on around issues like health system strengthening, the sustainability work that our colleagues in the Office of HIV/AIDS are engaged in, the tremendous policy work that's being supported by our Bureau of Food Security. The work that's going on in these sectors are really a virtual learning lab for, I think, for all of us as we think through how to better address these issues. So we're particularly excited to be here talking with all of you today, since there is so much fantastic research that IFPRI has been doing around policy reform issues, and a tremendous opportunity, I think, to think about how we would embed this analysis, bring the work that we've been doing in terms of supporting political change forward, and building a more multi-sector coalition to really taking these efforts forward in the field. So thank you very much for your time.